My name is Dennis Vaccaro, and I'm happy to be here in this seminar. It should be very, very exciting. We're looking forward to it. And to introduce Professor Thornber. And she's a 2006 PhD from Harvard's Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. Professor Thornber is a cultural historian and scholar of Asian literature and media, working primarily in the fields of environmental humanities, medical and health humanities, gender justice, environmental justice, climate justice, and other forms of justice and transculturation, which is translational studies, world literature, comparative literature. Professor Thornber conducts research in more than a dozen Asian and European languages, modern and classical. In addition to publishing actively 6 single-author scholarly books, 80 scholarly articles and chapters, and several edited volumes. Japanese literature translation. Professor Thornber has held a range of leadership and service positions at Harvard and well beyond, and taught, advised, and mentored graduate and undergraduate students from across the humanities and humanistic social sciences. Please join me in welcoming Professor Thornber to begin her presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you, everyone, for coming here this afternoon. I'm Karen Thornber, Harry Tuchman Levin Professor in Literature and Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at Harvard, where I also serve as president of Phi Beta Kappa Alpha Iota of Massachusetts. And my talk today is going to be on narrating environmental distress, stories of climate change, mental health, and inequality. But given that we're a group of alums here, I wanted to start with just a little bit about me. I've been at Harvard since 1996, so we're going on close to 30 years now. I came here directly from Princeton after I got my bachelor's in Princeton in comparative literature with minors in French, East Asian studies, and Japanese. I came from a comp lit department, and I joined Harvard's Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And GSAS then, as now, had and has phenomenal faculty. That was something that hit me instantly the moment I stepped foot on campus. But perhaps even more so than that, or more important than that to me, was the freedom I had as a student in GSAS to pursue what at the time, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, was a very unconventional topic. It was not what I told folks I was going to be working on when I applied to grad school, because I hadn't been exposed to the amazing things here at Harvard, and so I didn't, yet know what I was going to be doing. But I just wanted to give that shout out to GSAS that made possible, the last 30 years here, and certainly the last close to 20 years that I've been on the Harvard faculty. So I earned my PhD, as Dennis mentioned, in 2006 in East Asian Languages and Civilizations, with a dissertation that looked at intersections among modern Chinese, Japanese, and Korean literatures, as well as Taiwanese literatures and cultural history during the Japanese colonial period, which was 1895 to 1945. I was hired as assistant professor of comparative literature as I was completing my dissertation, joined the Harvard faculty in 2007, became associate professor 2011, and then was granted early tenure and full professorship in 2012. Now, my connections with GSAS have always run deep, but I just want to focus on the last bit of decade or so, just to give you a sense of the kind of involvement that our faculty can and sometimes do have with the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. So I've served on the Graduate Policy Committee since 2012. This is the major committee that decides a lot of graduate policy, really quizzes our deans, including Dean Sheila Thomas there in the back, on all these new policies and proposals and programs and all the new exciting things you're reading about GSAS. Well, many of them get vetted through Graduate Policy Committee, and I've just learned a tremendous amount serving on that committee, both from the GSAS deans as well as from my fellow colleagues. Served as Director of Graduate Studies in both comparative literature as well as in Regional Studies East Asia, our AM program that's celebrating its 75th anniversary, and a couple alums of RCA in the room here. So really excited about that. Acting chair of comparative literature, as well as regional studies East Asia. Also, I've been a longtime participant in Harvard Horizons as a selection committee member, as well as a faculty mentor. But even more important than all that, which is really important, I think, in other words, showing the deep involvement that faculty continue to have in GSAS, is that I've served on more than 50 Harvard dissertation committees across about 10 departments, 34 completed PhDs, most of whom are in tenure track or tenured positions. Certainly all of those students who wanted to be in tenured track positions are in tenure track positions. And I'm very proud of that, because we don't, it requires a lot of effort on the students' part, but also really good faculty mentorship. And I've been really lucky to work with other faculty who are as devoted to the students as am I. Of course, I employ GSAS students as teaching fellows. They make possible the amazing undergraduate courses that we run here, as well as research assistants for various research projects in which I'm engaged. And I wouldn't be able to do my research without my graduate students. Of course, I teach graduate seminars that bring together students from across disciplines. But maybe this should have the big bullet points and caps, all caps there. Sure, you've been keeping up with everything Dean Dench and her team are doing at GSAS to make the experience even better for our graduate students, to provide support for our graduate students that they haven't had in the past. And it's really exciting to see these new initiatives play out. So I just want to start, the presentation with kind of a celebration of GSAS. Everything that it's done for me really opened amazing new doors in my research and teaching, and enabled me to work with really talented groups of graduate students. As mentioned, my academic research has been inspired by my experiences in Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. As Dennis mentioned, I'm a cultural historian, transdisciplinary, transcultural approaches. My work is grounded in Asia, particularly study of East Asia, but I do strive for a more global vision that connects humanities and humanistic social science scholarship to global challenges. In other words, suggesting or proving, perhaps, or I hope so anyway, that we can't look at global challenges simply from one or two disciplines, that if we really want to tackle this world's greatest challenges, we have to look from multiple perspectives. So as Dennis mentioned, I have 4 books out, or the 4th is almost out within a month, and a couple in process. My first book, Empire of Text in Motion, Chinese, Korean, Taiwanese Transculturations of Japanese Literature, that was based on the dissertation, which again, I had no idea I was going to be writing when I started at Harvard. I came here purely to do Japanese studies, and then realized, wow, Japan connected to so many other places. Maybe I should look at something a little more transcultural. Got the funding from GSAS to do that kind of work, and that ended up in the first book. I was working on the first book. I stumbled in this new field, environmental humanities. I had not heard of that when I was in GSAS, but the nurturing of curiosity, of intellectual curiosity, inspiring me to take those intellectual risks that was really supported as a GSAS student, encouraged me to embrace this new field. Ended up writing a book on environmental crises in East Asian literatures back in 2012. Similarly, with medical humanities, again, it's not a field I had heard of when I was in graduate school, but that open-mindedness that my professors and my teachers encouraged in graduate school led me to embrace the medical humanities as well. And then my most recent book, Gender Justice, Contemporary Asian Literatures, that's coming out in a few months, and that's inspired by my work here on campus with both undergraduate and graduate students who have faced many challenges because of gender. My current book, though, and the focus of today's presentation, is Narrating Climate and Mental Health, Stories of Environmental Degradation and Inequality. This is a working title, and I say that because my editors at Bloomsbury do not like those parentheses around environ and mental, even though I love the fact that environmental and mental, but we're still talking about this. So this book is, I mentioned, commissioned by Bloomsbury Academic, and the manuscript's due in 2025, January, which when I signed the contract a year ago felt so far away. I was like, no problem. and now it's coming up closer. So this book is inspired by my previous work in environmental humanities and medical humanities, as well as in mental health and indigeneity. Mental health, I teach a very large general education course. We had 200 students the last time I taught it. Of course, that course would not be possible without my amazing teaching fellows from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. So this book is inspired by several concurrent and intersecting crises. First, crises in climate and environment. And I'm very careful here not simply to look at climate crises. I think it's important to look at climate crises in the broader context of environmental crises. Mental health crises and dearth of care, also thinking about mental health across species, and I'll get more into that in a moment. And then finally, inequality within and between communities, species, and so forth. So I'm going to address each of these crises very quickly, just to give us an overview and to make sure we're all on the same foundation. So crises in climate and environment and dearth of effective responses. I think if you're looking for a summary of our current climate and environmental crises, you'll find many. One that has particularly stood out to me is from Professor Rebecca Henderson's book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. Of course, Professor Henderson is a university professor here at Harvard over at the business school. And this is how she summarizes our current crises. She says, the world's on fire. The burning of fossil fuels is killing hundreds of thousands of people, while simultaneously destabilizing the Earth's climate, acidifying the oceans, and raising sea levels. Much of the world's topsoil is degraded, and demand for fresh water is outstripping supply. Left unchecked, climate change will substantially reduce GDP, flood the great coastal cities, and force millions of people to migrate in search of food. Insect populations are crashing. We are running the risk of destroying the viability of the natural systems on which we all depend. Just a quick summary of some of the many challenges we're facing in the field of climate and environment. We're also, as mentioned, facing crises in mental health. Mental health is a real concern with our students, both graduate and undergraduate. We see that all the time with both our graduate students and our undergraduate students, and how significantly it impacts not only their day-to-day lives, but also their ability to get the most out of their time at Harvard. But mental health is not just a problem with our students. Beyond campus, neuropsychiatric disorders are more than 10% of the global burden of disease. They're the leading contributors to years with disability. Before the COVID pandemic, about 1 billion people worldwide were estimated to be living with a mental health condition, and that number has jumped considerably since. Thinking about the numbers then of care workers, healthcare workers who are trained to assist folks who are suffering from mental health challenges. The median number of mental health workers globally is 9 per 100,000 population, or about 1 for every 11,000 people. Moreover, there's significant variation among high and low income countries, as well as within nations. So real dearth, I mean, you can just see the numbers are pretty striking there. Real dearth of mental health professionals given the really strong need. Moreover, in many parts of the world, tremendous stigmas continue to exist against mental illness. So you have situations where even when mental health care is available, folks don't take advantage of it because of the stigma attached. And if it's known or seen that you're going to see a mental health professional, you risk brutal and abusive treatment by your family, by broader society, and so forth. So these are just some of the challenges facing us in the realm of mental health. And all this, as noted, is from the WHO's mental health report from 2022. Finally, crises and inequality within and between nations. We know that many nations face growing and significant inequality. This is very true in the United States. It's also true in many places abroad. Thinking about climate and inequality, the impacts of climate disruption are quite disproportionate. So too are the impacts of environmental challenges and catastrophes. Generally, those most affected are the least responsible. This is where we get into questions of climate and environmental justice. As Jim Engel noted in his December 2023 talk for the Harvard Club of Boston, the richest 1% of humanity, or fewer than 80 million people, emit more than twice the carbon dioxide than do the poorest 50%, or 4 billion. So think about that. Richest 1% emit more than twice the carbon dioxide as the poorest 50%. Professor Engel continues, says the rich emissions are mostly personal, not emissions to create jobs or help others or do much good for the poorest half of humanity. Professor Engel also says it's colonialism at arm's length, no soldiers or occupation, but severe droughts and floods, rising seas, extreme weather, heat so unbearable people can't work in the daytime, and the inundation, outright elimination of certain island nations. There are tremendous gaps in care within and between nations, mental health care, physical health care, to name just two. But it's also important to recognize this isn't just about wealth. It's often portrayed as a matter of wealth and resources, but it's not just that. It's also about your gender, your race, your ethnicity, your education, your religion, other factors, with women, sexual and gender minorities, ethnic minorities, and other marginalized groups particularly affected. So when we speak about human health vis-a-vis environmental degradation and climate change, we're often referring to physical health, so cancer, lung disease, and so forth. But climate change and environmental degradation also have a tremendous impact on mental health. And so it's important to think of these intersections as well. And the below is from Dr. Elizabeth Pinsky of Mass General Hospital. I was fortunate enough to be a co-presenter with her in an event at the Harvard Center for the Environment a couple weeks ago, where she spoke explicitly about intersections between mental health and environmental health, climate health, and so forth. So this is from her research and the slides that she presented. So she talked in her presentation about how climate change impacts mental health directly through heat, through air pollution. And she talked about how heat, for instance, can impact sleep. It impacts cognition. It impacts learning. She talked also about how air pollution, chronic exposure to air pollution, makes one more susceptible to anxiety, to depression. It can lower IQ. It can lead to dementia even, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So it's important to think when we think about connections between environment, climate on the one hand, and human health on the other, that we don't just think about physical health. We think about mental health as well, directly and indirectly. And she also talked about how young people are at the greatest risk, right? They're at greater risk psychologically, physiologically, and developmentally just because of their vulnerability. So no surprise, the WHO and other entities are on this. They understand the connections between mental health and climate change. And in 2022, they put out a policy brief on this topic, which called on political and other leaders to make mental health a priority in responses to climate change. And this is particularly urgent, they argued, given the rising prevalence of mental health concerns quite apart from climate change. So a few moments ago, I spoke about this broader crises we have in mental health, on campus, off campus, and so forth. So if you have mental health or mental health concerns rising, instances of mental illness rising, and you know that climate change can make mental illness worse, can bring on new symptoms in folks who haven't had symptoms before, and you see climate change is getting worse, you can see where this is going, right? And so WHO and other organizations have been drawing attention to this in recent years. As I note on the slide here, this is one of many appeals in recent years to acknowledge the damage, both anticipated and actual environmental degradation, especially from climate change, inflicts on human mental and behavioral health and well-being. And just to cite one or a couple of journalists here who I think capture the spirit very well, Hanan Azmir and Marinel Mamak have argued They say we need to integrate climate considerations with mental health programs and mental health support with climate action. In other words, rather than doing these two things separately, thinking about climate action on the one hand, mental health support on the other, really integrate the two from the bottom up. So to give an example here of the types of mental health concerns that we see post-disaster, right? So the risk of PTSD after a disaster, acute disaster, increases significantly. And it increases even more if you're female, on your education level, if you have little or no education, in other words, lesser mobility, poverty, low economic status, physical illness, and so forth. So already PTSD, rates of PTSD rise after traumatic climate events, but your risk is even more extreme if you meet one of these or similar categories. One example that's often given is the aftermath of the 2021-2022 Malaysian floods. So what happened December 2021, January 2022, we had record precipitation at Selangor, Kuala Lumpur, and this was an extreme weather event linked to climate change that displaced more than 70,000 people. And that's what we saw generally in the headlines is, just how many thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were displaced. But the impact wasn't just destruction of property, it wasn't just displacement. In the aftermath, we saw higher rates of PTSD, such as anxiety, depression, paranoia, and so forth. And even though mental health professionals were brought in to help individuals who are suffering from these conditions, given the significant stigmas against PTSD and similar conditions in Malaysia, they found a lot of cases where folks didn't seek out this treatment. So even when the treatment was available, even when you had the mental health professionals there, individuals didn't seek it out because they were so afraid of what their family would say, what their neighbors would say, being stigmatized in really brutal ways. And, I did a lot of work before this project on stigma related to HIV/AIDS. And the dynamics are strikingly similar here. So in case of HIV/AIDS, if you're in societies, communities where the stigmas are pretty bad, really extreme, even if you have the best clinics and the best health professionals and medications and testing and everything available, if people don't feel as though they can access these services without being disowned by their families, without being kicked out of their societies, then they're not going to access them. And it's exactly the same dynamic we see in the aftermath of traumatic climate events, where you might have enough mental health professionals, at least briefly, but people don't take advantage of that because they don't feel as though they can without risking banishment from their families or from their broader communities. So, spend a few minutes talking about what happens after disasters. There's also what happens before, right? So just fear, anxiety of what will come. We know now that fear of climate change, of environmental destruction, is a chronic stressor for many individuals in society, primarily younger individuals. And there have been many terms that have been given to this phenomena: eco-anxiety, eco-guilt, ecological grief, solastalgia, biospheric concern. And basically, these terms are slightly different in their nuances, but they all share roots of powerlessness, despair, or uncertainty in anticipated or actual environmental changes. So again, it's this great fear that something's going to happen. These conditions are particularly impactful on individuals who already are suffering from other mental health conditions. To give an example, a recent Pew Research study found that 75% of people surveyed in Singapore are, quote, concerned that climate change will harm them personally. Now, of course, concern does not equal mental illness, but concern does mean, in this context, well-being isn't what it could be, right? People are anxious, and there's an anxiety that they're having difficulty dealing with because of their fear of what climate change will bring. And to give, an example again from Singapore, Good Space Singapore Writers Festival have been facilitating conversations about eco-anxiety just as a way of getting people to talk about this phenomena, talk about what they're feeling, and talk about ways to address this phenomena in productive ways. Now, I talked about post, talked about pre, but it's important to recognize that for a lot of individuals, these things are all wrapped up together. It's very interrelated, intersectional. One case study that I found particularly helpful in illustrating this is from an article by Adwali et al., Mental Health and Climate Change in Africa. And what they did in this article is a case study on Ghanaian farmers whose mental health suffered significantly from livestock diseases that led to tremendous loss of livestock. And the livestock diseases were caused by changes related to changes in environment related to climate change. And what they point out here is the very clear intersection of acute events, chronic changes, and economic and social threats. So on the one hand, these farmers were faced with acute events, like extreme weather events. But they also, in addition to the acute events, were faced with chronic changes. So relentless heat over periods of months and years, drought over the period of months and years, decreased air quality months and years, and so forth. So you combine the acute with the chronic. Also, the economic and social threats that folks were facing. Sometimes these were real threats, job loss, migration, food insecurity, and so forth. But often they were actual are real threats. But anyway, so I made a little mistake there on the slide. Assumed threats, right? So they're worried that they're going to lose jobs, be forced to migrate, food insecurity, and so forth. And all these factors together lead to PTSD, aggression, depression, anxiety, and even suicide. So here too, it's really important to think of these different factors in relation to one another. Although, we tend just to focus on either acute or chronic or so forth, but it's all very interrelated. There have been various responses to these kind of interrelated factors. One, and I bring this up here because several Harvard faculty members are engaged in this. This is the Asia Pacific Disaster Mental Health Network, established about 4 years ago now, that brings together leading disaster psychiatry, psychology, and public health experts. And basically what they've done is they've taken a regional approach, which is kind of unusual because often when we talk about mental health solutions, it's very focused on particular communities or nations and so forth. But here they wanted, and also with disaster responses, it's the same kind of thing. But here they brought together individuals from different parts of Asia to really think about mental health and disaster in a more holistic way. And to brainstorm, how do we strengthen community engagement? How do we support or assess mental health systems vis-a-vis disasters? How do we optimize emerging technologies in mental health care? How do we understand and respond to mental health impacts of climate change? And finally, and I think most importantly, was their emphasis on prioritizing mental health and psychosocial support for high-risk groups within the disaster-affected populations of the Asia-Pacific region. So identifying, even before major acute disasters hit, who's at the most risk, not only of the particular acute disaster itself, but who's at the most risk for mental health concerns, psychosocial concerns, and so forth, and to address that right off the bat. So I've spent the past 20 minutes or so talking about the broader context in which my book is situated. And now I want to spend the last few minutes here focusing on the book itself and giving you a sense of where I'm going. And I'm really looking forward to your feedback. So just a reminder, the book's titled Narrating Climate and Mental Health, Stories of Environmental Degradation and Inequality. And basically what this book does, given that I'm a cultural historian, a scholar of literature, is that the book analyzes stories in a range of genres from diverse sites globally. Everything from Inuit and Sami stories from up north to indigenous Taiwanese, Polynesian narratives, bestsellers, blockbusters from Asia, Africa, Arctic, Pacific, Americas, and Europe, to little-known cultural products from these sites. So I'm not, as in some of our books, focusing on particular regions or particular types of work. I'm really trying to get a broad panoply of stories in this book and engage with a broad panoply of narratives. So you might say, why stories? Isn't climate change, isn't that something that the scientists are going to solve? Well, yes, but not without the help of humanities and humanistic social sciences. What do I mean by that? Well, Stories bring to us individual voices. They humanize the experience of folks on the ground who are actually experiencing climate change, who are experiencing mental health concerns. They provide us with very different perspectives from climate science, from public policy, and so forth. And I'm not going to say, the humanities will solve all our problems. That's, of course, not the case. But what I will say is that when we're trying to solve some of the world's greatest problems, it's really important to listen to voices who are experiencing these things in very different ways, right? And I'll get into a few more details than that in the following slides. There's also the very real healing power of just doing the arts. And we know this from our work in medical humanities, individuals who are suffering from whether it's terminal conditions or chronic conditions, very serious conditions, that doing art helps actually with one's mental health. It helps with connection. We know this from our studies of loneliness, that art making, art creating, not only can put you in better touch with yourself, but also can put you in better touch with others. Using art to inspire, and so forth. We also know that stories can generate hope, thought, and action through imagination. This is a quotation just from a blurb, a recent book on literature as a lens for climate change. But we see this happen all the time, right? Stories, other people's voices, experiences really can make us think in new and different ways and ideally inspire action. And finally, the kind of stories I'm really interested in for my book are not just those stories that alert us to experiences that help us think and feel what others are going through, but those that can help convert, and the words here of Azmir and Marmak in the climate anxiety issue, convert anxiety and anger into agency and action. So stories that work in ways that can help, not everyone's going to respond in the same ways, but that hopefully will inspire us to help make change. So the book's divided into 4 chapters. I'll go through each individually momentarily, but just to give you an overview, the first relates to impact of environmental degradation, climate change on human mental health, talking about things like climate anxiety, PTSD, mental illness directly caused by pollutants, and so forth. That's probably going to be the most straightforward chapter to write. And the second one is thinking about degrading environments or our treatment of environments as a sign of maybe mental illness. I don't like the term mental illness there. I don't think it's quite right, but I don't have another good term, and I'll explain more about this momentarily. Chapters 3 and 4 are a little more experimental. Here, I want us to think more broadly about mental health, or maybe it's just mental well-being of non-human species, so animals and plants, which I realize is experimental, but I'll explain why I'm doing this in a moment. So as mentioned, chapter 1 is probably the most straightforward. There are dozens of possible case studies from around the world, from across media. I'll just introduce 2 for you here that I'm almost certain to be using. One is Sheila Watt-Cloutier's The Right to Be Cold. And I'll just show that's Watt-Cloutier, and that's her book, The Right to Be Cold. She's Canadian Inuk. She was born in 1953 in Nunavik. That's up in northern Quebec. She lived at home until age 10, then went to school in Nova Scotia and Manitoba as part of the Canadian Indian residential school system. As she became an adult, she became an activist, a representative for Inuit, including serving as president and then international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. And The Right to Be Cold is her memoir. So she starts out this memoir in the prologue outlining historical traumas of Indigenous Canadians, including the trauma of being taken from their communities as young children to be educated in southern Canada. So right from the outset, even though this book does talk a lot about environment, mental health issues vis-a-vis climate change and so forth, she puts this in much, much greater context. She also, through this book and right beginning in the prologue, talks about reconceptualizing the Arctic. And she says, quote, "The Arctic is not a frozen wasteland. Its ice and snow are teeming with life, not just marine and animal life, but human life. The Arctic is much more than polar bears and seals." And what she's referring to here is Western, primarily white Western efforts, to save the polar bears, save the seals. That's all great, But she says the efforts that are being made are ignoring the fact that you have indigenous communities that are living with the polar bears and seals and have been for generation after generation. And any effort that you make to save the polar bear has to be made in conjunction with efforts to help the people, who are dependent on these animals as well. And then finally, she talks right in the prologue about her book as working to inspire others to take up the cause of climate change. So like many of the individuals with whose work I'm working, it's not about, all despair. It's about hope and action, even within great despair. So in the book itself, she, as mentioned, contextualizes the broader environmental traumas, talking about breakdowns of Inuit society even before the worst impacts of climate change. She talks about the impacts of historical traumas on Indigenous mental health, the alcohol abuse that has plagued her family for several generations, and showing how already you're faced with a really vulnerable population. She talks about the discovery of POPs, so persistent organic pollutants in the Arctic, the impact of botched responses on Indigenous populations, particularly, she says, as these resonate with misplaced gun control laws, earlier dog slaughters, other government actions done in the name of saving environments, but at the same time harming Indigenous peoples. She speaks throughout of the impact on mental health, but configured really broadly. And that's something that is really inspiring to me about her work, is that often when we talk about mental health or mental illness, it's a particular condition, or it's in a particular community, or it's at a particular time. And what she's doing is really broadening our understandings. She also emphasizes connections, right? Connections among northern communities, which we might take for granted. Well, yes, northern Canada, Greenland, northern Scandinavia. Well, of course, everything's connected, but it's not so simple, because she speaks really explicitly of growing up and thinking of her own community as really isolated there. It's really hard to get from one place to another. There are few direct flights, right? But it's not just that. It's not just the northern communities. She talks of connections among communities globally, speaking of her travels to Africa, meeting tribal women, meeting Nelson Mandela, and really starting to understand how the challenges that she and her community are facing are so directly related and quite similar to challenges that folks are facing in areas with very different climates, very different cultures, languages, customs, and so forth. But so much of what they're experiencing is actually the same. The interconnections don't stop there, right? She talks about connections between humans and plants and animals, even as everything is changing. She speaks explicitly about the spiritual loss that comes with climate change, that comes with environmental degradation, but that has been coming again for generations. She's very explicit about the fact that to Arctic Indigenous peoples and to many Indigenous peoples, climate change is emphatically a cultural issue. And I can't emphasize this enough. Sometimes people balk if I say, well, climate change is a cultural issue. No, it's a scientific issue. It's, an engineering problem. Yes, it is, but science and engineering are embedded in culture. And so if we don't understand the broader cultures, if we don't understand the peoples and other communities affected, we're not going to be able to solve our world's greatest problems. As noted, there's tremendous grief that's permeating this memoir, but there's also tremendous hope. Finally, she talks about the paradoxes of the extractive industry, mining in this case, which was brought in to help her community. And I've just, inserted a passage here from late in the volume where, the bold is mine, that's not hers. But this passage is like many in the work where she talks very explicitly about impacts on well-being. So we may not say, well, this is a sign of mental illness, although certainly, suicide, but it's well-being more broadly. And she says, we may bring in new industries, in this case, extractive industry, in other cases, different industries, but we don't think about how, she says, how is our community, the men, women, youth who know the land, who've been part of the land, how are they going to feel at the end of a workday spent digging up and destroying the very land they've held sacred? Well, these short-term jobs really address the dispiritedness of our men, a dispiritedness that's the root of social and health ailments of our communities. Have self-destruction, suicide rates been lowered in other parts of the indigenous world where resource extraction has been used as a means to pull communities out of poverty. And here in the last sentence, really calling our attention to the fact that, we kind of repeat the same mistakes, right? We can see that something's not working in one place. So what do? Do we stop, rethink, regroup, figure out how we can do it better somewhere else? Well, sometimes yes, but often no. And so she's calling us out on that. All in all, though, as I note here at the bottom, there's a much broader understanding of mental health and well-being, particularly vis-a-vis climate and environment, that she brings to this work that I think is really helpful for us to understand, again, just how pervasive these challenges are and how deep-rooted they are. Another case study I'm likely to use in this chapter is from a very different part of the world, the Philippines. It's a narrative titled Agam, Filipino Narratives on Uncertainty and Climate Change. And this comes from the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities in the Philippines. This book was put together in response to Typhoon Yolanda. Typhoon Yolanda, November 2013, is the largest or one of the strongest tropical cyclones in history, killing more than 6,000 people in the Philippines alone and displacing millions. And what this institute did is they commissioned pieces from artists, writers, and thinkers from different parts of the Philippines to talk about not only the impact of this one typhoon on their communities, but to link it to other things in history, right? So you find in these essays connections to past empires, current neocolonialism, economic and environmental injustice, and destruction wrought by human-induced climate change from the past, as well as going forward responsibilities to future generations. The volume speaks of climate justice, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, really forcing us to rethink our conceptions of justice, primarily intergenerational as well as transnational justice. And finally, and most relevant to the work I'm doing in this book, is it grapples with mental health concerns and inequality amid climate disruption. Just give you just one example of that. This is an essay by Sheila Coronel titled Unnatural Disasters. And it's interesting how she starts off. She says, we in the Philippines live disaster to disaster. Somehow we survive. We should be used to it by now. Disaster is our country's twin. With it come death and destruction. Devastation visits us regularly. We've grown accustomed to its face. So look what's going on here. It's like, we have one disaster, then another disaster. We survive. We should be used to it by now. It's our twin. Death and destruction, they come. Devastation's regular around here. We've grown accustomed to it. This passage is pretty much emphasizing just how regular this is. We're accustomed to it. This is the usual means. But then there are hints that maybe something isn't quite right. She says we should be used to it by now. Somehow we survive. And that sort of doubt, uncertainty is brought to the fore later in the essay when she talks about how, we tend to think about natural disasters, or in this case, unnatural disaster, in terms of casualty counts, numbers displaced, and so forth. And she's very explicit about the fact. She said, these statistics don't really tell us all that much. She says they tell us little about the toll on those whom the dead have left behind. How do you count a mother's grief at the loss of her children to a flood, a boy's bewilderment at being orphaned by a storm? So she's not speaking explicitly about mental illness here, but she's talking very explicitly about well-being and mental well-being and grief and bewilderment and a whole host of other emotions. So those are just, a couple examples from the first chapter, which, as I mentioned, is going to be pretty straightforward. There's just a lot of text to choose from. Things become a little trickier when I move into the second chapter, where I talk about degrading environments as a sign of, mental illness, or again, that term is not quite right here, but I'll explain where I'm coming from. So I'm really inspired in this part by the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. He was born in 1953, member of the Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma. But in addition to being an indigenous individual, a member of indigenous community, she also has her PhD in plant ecology. And what she does in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants, is really combine the two. So combine that scientific knowledge with indigenous knowledge. She speaks in this book of our compulsive overconsumption. She talks about how we've, quote, unleashed a monster with our consumption-driven mindset. She speaks of our leaders as, quote, willfully ignoring the wisdom and the models of every other species on the planet. There she is, and there's braiding sweetgrass. And then she connects this with this Wendigo phenomena. So the Wendigo or the Wendigo, there are other names too that are given to this. This is a figure from Algonquin folklore that, among other things, embodies greed and excess. And she describes what she, means by this. She says, a Wendigo is a human being who's become a cannibal monster. Its bite will transform victims into cannibals too. It's the name for that within us which cares more for its own survival than anything else. A human whose selfishness has overpowered self-control to the point that satisfaction is no longer possible. The Wendigo, when you start looking into indigenous folklore, mythology, and so forth, it takes on many, many different forms. But one of the most prominent forms is this idea of an individual with, a form of mental illness, although that term is not used explicitly. That's why I'm not so comfortable with the term in this context. But I think you can see something's not quite right. Like something's gone wrong with this individual, and they are compelled to overconsume. And the more they consume, the hungrier they are. So the more they consume, and so forth. And I'm interested in exploring this a bit more. The Wendigo appears really frequently, shockingly frequently actually, in literature, film, and media. And I give a couple possible case studies from my book. But I'm also interested in looking, and I have a research assistant who's going to be working on this for me over the summer, for looking for similar figures in African, Asian, Pacific Northwest in the United States, other indigenous myths and stories that feature the overconsumer as suffering from mental illness, or what we might call mental illness. And then thinking about, how we might reconceptualize or think about our treatment of environments, as, in this broader context. Again, I'm not quite sure how this will play out, but I'm really interested in this idea and how it's been imagined by different, particularly indigenous communities, and the implications this has for our understanding, the implications this has for our understanding of mental health and mental illness. And then finally, just wrapping things up here, as mentioned, chapters 3 and 4, even more experimental, decentering people in discourse on mental health. So in other words, thinking about mental health as a more than human concern. I start in chapter 3 with animals, non-human animals. We know the impacts that climate change has on non-human animals, individual species loss, including extinction, higher rates of infectious disease, habitat loss, loss of food, forced migration, adaptation to new environments, phenological mismatch, and so forth. Question, though, is to what extent these cause distress or anxiety, are these even the correct terms? We do know from science that there are real overlaps between human and non-human animals vis-a-vis mental illness, and I just give one example there. We also know that environmental pollutants do cause mental health disorders or can cause mental health disorders in animals. And a great example is from Laura Braitman's Animal Madness, Inside Their Minds. She gives a case study of sea lions who've been affected by a chemical and are acting, she says, as though they're mad, right? She says domic acid bathes their brains over a sustained period. It can literally drive them crazy. She says, too, with every passing year, there seem to be more opportunities to plumb the relationship between red tides and sea lions' mental health. We're still in the early stages, I would think, or I would argue, of understanding animal consciousness, animal well-being, and so forth. But this is a really exciting field in the sciences now, and I'm eager to see, how it's been imagined by those outside the sciences in relation to the science as it continues to develop. Okay. And then finally, in the fourth chapter, things get even more experimental with the role of plants. Of course, we know for centuries, philosophers, other intellectuals have speculated to plant intelligence, plant consciousness, plant language, communication, plant suffering, and so forth. The science is growing on this, continues to deepen our empirical knowledge, and literature and media have followed suit, as has the more interdisciplinary field of critical plant study. So I think there's a lot of exciting work here that's being done, again, in the sciences, but also thinking about how that's been reflected or not in cultural production. So how have different communities and cultures imagined well-being of plants? We do know that, of course, changing climate, environments change plants' physiological processes, growth rates, reproductive patterns, and so forth. And there are many examples of this. What we don't know, of course, is how this how this physical distress affects any kind of mental distress. Can we even talk about that vis-a-vis plants? So really interested in looking here, again, largely at indigenous stories, but other stories as well, is how have we imagined the well-being of other species, and how does that change or not our conceptions of climate crises, environmental degradation, and mental health more broadly. So just wrapping up here, just want to reemphasize the importance of tackling global concerns from broad interdisciplinary perspectives, importance of including mental health more rigorously in discussions of climate change, environmental degradation. I think, it's also important to think more about indigenous perspectives, which paradoxically or not resonate with recent scientific discoveries regarding animal and plant consciousness. It really is paradoxical here. We've long dismissed indigenous perspectives. Oh, it's not scientific, there's no proof, and so forth. But the more our science grows, the more we discover overlaps and resonances. And then finally, thinking about mental health, or at least well-being of not just greater range of human communities, but also greater range of species, and how that might impact our understandings both of mental health and of climate and environmental crises. So I'll stop there and open up for questions. Thanks so much, everyone. Yes?
I love your title. I hope you
We have to record for history.
Oh, no.
Right.
Establishing in the historical record right here and now. I love your title. I hope you stick with the parentheses, even if it means not sticking with that publisher, because I agree with you. It's a great title. Don't give up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Regarding, I think you call them the Wendigo, or I don't know if you've looked at Ukraine, ironically, that. But okay, I was at GSAS the same time you were here, and you look vaguely familiar to me. I was in the archaeology wing of the anthropology department. But amongst many things, I'm a musician, and after Russia invaded Ukraine, I hired a bunch of Ukrainian filmmakers to make music videos for my songs. Mm-hmm. And one of them, we haven't released it yet, but I can connect you to him.
Yeah.
He set one of my songs to a Ukrainian folktale that has a figure that reminds me of a Wendigo. And he set it up to be a metaphor for Russia invading Ukraine through the lens of this native folktale. Interestingly, last year, some scientists in Poland came out with a study to show that they believe that the genetic root, basically, of narcissism is in that area. Right. Okay. So I think that that's a really interesting possibility, and I just wanted to share that.
Yes. Yeah, if you could
absolutely
connect that. Yep. that's terrific. Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We got a question back here.
Thank you. Where I hoped you were going to go with this was to recommend or yourself set up groups of people who are suffering from climate anxiety to help do things to ameliorate climate destruction, and see if that activity of helping make things better wouldn't help their mental health problems, which I certainly think it would. Could that be a last chapter?
Yes, and I think that is embedded in the spirit of the book, as changing anxiety to action. We actually have a lot of examples of that. Perhaps one of the most prominent is Greta Thunberg herself, right, who suffers from mental health condition and has used her own activism as a way to ameliorate that, and also to, of course, do great good.
But to come out just really clearly and recommend that and try to get more people doing it, I think.
I like it. Yeah, to highlight that. I think that's a great idea. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Maybe 15 minutes ago, there's a line up there that really intrigued me. And I think you said something like environmental degradation is a sign of, in parentheses, question mark, of mental illness. So I was just wondering, was that doubt that you weren't sure if that is the right description, or were you looking for an alternative? Blank could be blank to link the two, and I have an idea. That's all.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Mabel. That's an excellent question. No, the question mark is there because this is still a very controversial topic and field. And when I present on this, people often will challenge me on it and say that this is not mental illness at all. And so I'm uncomfortable at this point making a claim. And the question mark is more to signal others' concern that this isn't quite, and I don't know whether mental illness is quite the right term yet either. So maybe that's where it,
Right, because when I was looking at it, I immediately wonder whether or not it's an extension.
An extension of
mental illness.
I like the word extension.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just hit me wanting to help with the description, if that is something you were concerned with, and thanks for the explanation.
Yeah. I like extension versus sign. I think that works really well. Thank you. I think we have,
Hi, I run an environmental NGO, and we work in areas, former mining areas, that go through energy transition. So one of the things that we noticed and we did not look for at all was a lot of domestic violence in the area. As a result, we didn't do an analysis. We just ran into economic hardship, mental distress, I would call it. I wouldn't go as much as mental illness, poor capacity of the community to deal with these issues, inversal of the roles in the family between the miner who used to earn and the woman who used to stay at home, and now it's reversed because he doesn't have work. So just as a suggestion for you, maybe for future research, since you seem to be interested in climate and you seem to be interested in inequality, and this seems to me a gender equality thing, and you seem to be interested in mental wellness. I'll go for the positive. Maybe to look more into this, because we just noticed this. We didn't read a paper, we didn't read a study that this might be an unintended effect of the green transition. And in Europe, we have what is called the Just Transition, which is a program that the European Commission put together such that this community would not be left behind. But they didn't think about these things. They thought only about the economic aspects and about, in this case, the miners who were left without jobs, right? So they would have new jobs. But they didn't think that unintended consequences on women and families in this household. So since you are so interested in this sort of multidisciplinary approach, I think it would be lovely to see more research in this area. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a wonderful comment. And it's interesting because in my book on gender, which is coming out soon, I didn't really talk about texts that deal with intersections of gender and climate, but I do put that in as an area that we need to do more research on, because you're absolutely right. And it's not just Europe we see that. We see that in Asia, where, that book's focused on Asia. So yes, I think bringing in the gender component here is vital. And thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Well, I guess I have a comment. So we have a little place up in Maine, and I don't know if you're you've got this on your list already, but the Gulf of Maine is warming up faster than any other place along the East Coast. And as a result, it's had an impact on the fishing industry. And one aspect of it is that there was a thing called Maine shrimp. Has anybody ever heard of Maine shrimp? Yeah, okay. Well, Maine shrimp, when we first built our place up there in the early 80s, was a big deal. These are little tiny shrimp, and you can buy buckets of them for $1. Cook them all up, and they were really fantastic. I think you you sort of used more calories eating the shrimp than you got from the shrimp, but it was a lot of fun, especially with beer. They disappeared. They just flat out disappeared about 10 years ago. Gone. And it happened sort of overnight. And it must have had an impact because there were plenty of trucks along Route 1 selling these things. And that sort of thing. So that's number one. Yeah. Number two, lobster. Everybody's heard of lobster? Okay. So what's going on with lobster is that, they molt every year. They shed their shell, and this always happened around the 4th of July. And then, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago, all of a sudden, and after they've shed, I got to say this first, some language. After they shed the shell, they're referred to as shedders, coincidentally. And so they don't talk about molting. So they're shedders. And so the shedders, instead of appearing on the 4th of July, started appearing in May. And this just freaked everybody out. Because, a lot of these lobstermen have been, fishing in their family for 100 years. I mean, they got a lot of experience there. And this was just unheard of. No. So it's had a mental impact on these people. And occasionally we're at a restaurant, we'll start talking to somebody. And one time we ended up talking to a person whose family was doing lobstering, and they were barely surviving during the pandemic. Because remember, lobster prices went, stupid high back then. Well, they weren't getting any of that money. It was all the later guys. So they were beginning to think, is it over? Lobstering? And by the way, there used to be plenty of lobster in Long Island Sound. I don't know if you can get them anymore. On the Cape, they're having problems. So I always say this, and nobody believes me, but I personally think it's a plot by Canada to monopolize the lobster industry. Don't tell anybody you heard this here, because it might get you into trouble. But they're all walking north. Oh, and they've got to go out further to get them, because they used to be right on the shore, but it's too hot. So they got to, gas. They got to go out further. And it's not cheap. So we have a huge thing that you talking about, right there. Over there.
And that's the locals in particular, but probably also, folks like us who visit. Oh, yeah. And are impacted in very different ways.
And it's very local because, there are, just where we are in the Pemmican Peninsula, there are a number of harbors there, and that's where the lobstermen come from to do it. And actually, we became very friendly with one of the lobster places there, and he said that basically the little lobster shack that they had was about this is the co-op. In this area. The lobster shack was about 5% of their revenue. The other 95% of their revenue was shipping lobster to Canada for processing for cruise lines.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
international implications, so
Yeah.
to speak.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's happening right here in our backyard, and we see this every year.
Yeah.
And one minor thing is, back in the 80s on the little lake that we're on, there used to be about 18 inches of ice on the lake. Jan 1, the beginning of ice fishing season. This year, there were exactly 0 inches of ice
Yeah.
on the lake on Jan 1. So they drove trucks out on the lake, trucks, because you had 18 inches or a foot of ice and it was no problem. Now you're lucky to get an inch, and it's just gigantic. Now you need a boat to do ice fishing. So there we go.
It's a great
Thank you.
example. Thank you. Hi.
Okay, before we go,
Thank you.
there is the extra thank you, the Harvard Griffin GSAS. People would love to give you this
Oh, thank you so much.
as an appreciation for your really
you.
very thought-provoking,
And very
actually
relevant.
thought-initiating.
Initiating.
We're not even up to provoking. We're like, oh, we never thought about that before.
Thank you so much. Thank you.